Welcome to the course of Introduction to Rail Transportation. In this lecture, we will give a general picture of power supply modes of electric railways. We're going to cover the following aspects: the power supply from the electrical power system to the TS, the power supply from the TS to the OCS, power supply from the OCS to a locomotive. We can see from the animated cartoon that by using different power supply modes, the power supply of electric railways is completed by the transmission of power from electric power system to traction substation, then from the traction substation to OCS, and finally from OCS to locomotive. The power supply from the electric power system to the TS. There are three modes: single power supply, dual power supply, and hybrid power supply. Single power supply. In single-end feeding mode, each regional substation powers one or two TS. To ensure reliability, each TS adopts double-circuit transmission lines of the redundant structure. Double-end feeding. Two regional substations feed a TS. The transmission lines serve as the passages to connect the two regional substations. This mode can be further divided into single-circuit power supply and double-circuit power supply. Loop power supply. The TS forms a ring network with the primary system at the high voltage side. It's reliable for the power supply but quite costly. The power supply from the TS to the OCS. There are three modes: single-end feeding in single-track lines, single-end feeding with the parallel connection at ends in double-track lines, and all parallel feeding in double-track lines. The single-end feeding in single-track lines. Each substation is independent. The feeding section of OCS is fed by a TS at one end. A feeding section of OCS is usually called a supply arm. The arms of two adjacent TS are insulated, and a locomotive can only feed on one related TS. The single-end feeding with the parallel connection at ends in double-track lines. Both single-end feeding and the double-end feeding can be adopted in double-track lines. The diagram tells the double-end feeding requires complicated equipment in feeding sections. Only single-end feeding mode is applied in double-track lines in China at present. The all-parallel feeding in double-track lines. In each station, load switches are inserted to form a parallel connection with the OCS of both tracks. Power supply from the OCS to a locomotive. There are four feeding systems: the direct feeding system, the booster transformer feeding system, the auto transformer feeding system, the axle cable feeding system. The direct feeding system. The OCS, rails, and the ground form a loop to feed the locomotive. This mode is the simplest, with the lowest investment, smaller impedance of traction network, and less energy consumption. However, a part of currents flow to the earth from rails, posing inductive interference on communication lines. Direct feeding system with a return wire. This mode can further reduce the impedance of traction networks and provide better feeding service, but it's a little bit costly. The BT feeding system. As a booster transformer is connected in series with the traction network, the impedance of the traction network is 50% stronger than in a direct feeding system. The AT feeding system. The system is usually applied in heavy-haul, high-speed, and other heavy-loaded electric railways. Meanwhile, as the OCS and the positive feeder carry traction load currents in opposite directions, there's little induced interference in neighboring telecommunication lines. The CC feeding system. The feeder and the return conductor are placed coaxially in one cable with a short distance in between. Thus, the coefficient of mutual induction increases. Traction current and the return current almost all flow out from coaxial power cables. No interference on the communication lines nearby. There's low impedance, and the system can support the long-distance power supply. Through learning of this lecture, we have understood the power supply from the electrical power system to the TS, learned the power supply from the TS to the OCS, learned power supply from the OCS to a locomotive. We need to master some basic related words and expressions. Want to know more about China's rail transportation? Stay with us till next time. Thank you.